Hello, this is Julie Cahigas from the University of Akron, and this is an overview of the news release, which is one of the most ubiquitous public relations writing formats. So this presentation will teach us about what news releases are for, what types of news releases there are, and then we'll offer up a format that you can use to create your own news releases. First of all, what is a news release? A news release is a written document, usually one page, maybe up to 2 or 3 pages, but generally a one-page document that does the following things. At its most basic, the news release entices the media to write a story about a newsworthy event or a newsworthy announcement or some other newsworthy information. The news release provides as much information as possible to make that story easy to write, so the media person shouldn't have to do a lot of extra work once they have the release. They should have most of the facts that they need, and then they might want to call for an interview or a quote, or might do some other side research to add dimension to the story, but basically all of the key information should be in the release. Sometimes news releases are written just to get an event listing. So think about your local newspaper. A lot of times they have an event listing both in the paper and online, where they talk about upcoming events or things that are of interest to readers. Any kind of listings are things that we might use a press release to get. News releases can notify media of an upcoming event or opportunity for them to visit, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about media advisories, which is a type of release. It's not a news release, it's a little bit separate, but we also use news releases to do this as well, to notify the media that something's upcoming and that we'd like them to attend. Sometimes we use news releases to stand alone on a website. So if you've ever gone to a company's website, clicked on their media room or their news section and pulled up their news releases, you might do that to learn information about current events at a particular company or organization. And then lastly, news releases can provide additional clarification for an existing story. That's really common when you have a crisis release or a spot release. So for example, there is, let's talk about back a couple years ago when a little kid fell into the cheetah pit at the Cleveland Zoo, right? You had some information that came out to the media right away, and then maybe like 6 to 12 hours later, the zoo had more information about the incident, what actually happened, what the bystanders and witnesses saw, and so they might put out a second release to clarify information about that story. So that's what that means. Here are the different types of releases, and I will say that this is not an exhaustive list, and you'll notice at the end there's kind of a catch-all that's things that aren't on this list, but your most basic release is going to be an announcement release, and the definition seems pretty simple. Make an announcement, right? So an event release would fall under an announcement release. We're announcing an event or announcing something's going to happen. You could announce new employees. So I would consider a new employee a type of announcement release. You can announce promotions. You can announce new products. So launches are announcement releases. So that's what announcement releases are. Very simple. A created news release is an announcement release plus a newsworthy angle, which we would call, I guess we would call it an angle creator. So what does an angle creator mean? Let's say that you're having a conference in Cleveland. Let's say you're having a event planning and fashion conference, and you're not getting a lot of play in the media. They just don't think it's that newsworthy. No one's really concerned about you having this conference. Well, then you decide that in order to make your conference more newsworthy, you're going to bring, let's say, David Totera. If you don't know who David Totera is, he's a very famous wedding planner, event planner. But hopefully you know who he is, or this won't quite make as much sense. I mean, I guess I could say something like Kim Kardashian, but I think David Totera is the right sort of person. So your event convention would hire David Totera to come be your keynote speaker or to come give a presentation. And then the news release would be, David Totera is coming to our convention, right? Not we're having a convention, which maybe you've already released and nobody picked it up. Nobody did a story on it. But now David Totera is headlining our convention. Oh, well, that's news. People care about David Totera. The newspaper wants to write about him, so they do. That's why we call it created news. We're creating it. It's not news in and of itself necessarily, but we're adding some kind of a newsworthy angle creator like David Totera to get people to pay attention to our event, product, etc. Another type of news release is a spot news release. And this one you have to distinguish between this one and one that's coming up later called a bad news release. A spot news release, I think unexpected or on the spot is a great way to remember this. When your company's put on the spot, you need a spot release. This is also what I would call a crisis news release. So if something catastrophic or unexpected happens, kid falls in the cheetah pit, your factory catches on fire, there's a winter storm that keeps you from leaving the office, your CEO is caught having an affair and embezzling money from the company, you are robbed in the middle of the night, you declare bankruptcy, you're a bus company and one of your buses hits a guy on a bicycle. Any of those would be crises, right? And they would require a spot news release. Spot news releases can be challenging because a lot of times you're sort of dealing with the information you have at the moment, which may not be complete information. So spot releases can be challenging to write and source. So often they're followed up by additional information. If you're reporting at 4 a.m. to your company because there's been some sort of an accident, okay, chances of you having complete information at that moment are not very good. So you'll put out a release with what you do know, and then as you know more details, you'll continue to update that spot release. A response release might sound like the same thing, but it's not. Okay, so this one is also a little bit hard to distinguish from spot and bad news. A response release responds to an external event that affects the company. For example, you are a shoe manufacturer and a consumer report comes out that says your shoes just aren't that great. Now, that is a crisis as well, right? It's not the same sort of a crisis as a fire because it's a little bit external to the company. You don't control it necessarily. And it's not urgent, like if you don't get information to the media, they're going to make up a story about this consumer report. That's not the case. However, it might be unexpected and it might be a crisis for you, right? So you want to write a response. A response release responds to an external event. So not something that happens in your company, but something maybe that's said about your company, and it responds to it. So that's the basic definition there. A feature release is one that we don't write quite as often in the PR world, but sometimes. A feature release tries to tell a story in the way that a feature story tells a story. So if you think about a feature story you might have read, like let's say a feature story on fall and particularly going to the local apple farm. Let's say you're Mapleside Apple Farms up on Pearl Road in the Brunswick area, and you want to get a story in the local magazine about the experience at your apple farm, and you want the story to cover everything from the history of your farm to current events that happen to the different varietals of apples to why going on those fall days to the apple farm with your family is still important in 2020. Okay, imagine that that's something that your organization, Mapleside Apple Farm, that you want to get out there. Well, you're not going to write a hard news release that says, Mapleside Farms has 16 different attractions this fall, right? That's not going to create that feature feel in the story that's written. If you want a hard news story, you send out your basic inverted pyramid, which we'll talk about, hard news release. But if you want a feature story that, like I said, goes through all those different topics and kind of takes someone on a journey, then you need to write a feature release. So it's storytelling based, and oftentimes it's tied to relevant events in the news or the market. For example, when I talk about this Mapleside story, we wouldn't do it in January, right? We would do it maybe in August, right before the fall season starts, right when people start to get their, spiced pumpkin lattes and their sweaters out. That's when the story would come. So it's tied to sort of that market or that relevant event, which is sort of everybody getting ready for back to school in the fall. Okay, that's a feature release. A bad news release is a release that deals with bad news. Wow, what a profound definition. So what does this mean? Your company is going to go bankrupt. And it's not a crisis in that you kind of know it's coming and you have to restructure your debt and it's just some bad news. Well, you want to release that bad news to the media before they find out about it. You don't want the media to find out about your bankruptcy when you do your filing. You want to give them the information ahead of time, and you want to be really detailed and give them the full correct information. Because what happens is when you go to file bankruptcy, if the media finds out you're doing that based on your filing, so they look at the government record and they find it, their tone and what they know is going to be like less. They're going to make assumptions. They're just going to headline the story with such and such place is going bankrupt. They're not going to have information about what you're doing to fix the problem. So for that reason, bad news releases are what we call inoculation efforts. It's like giving somebody a vaccine of the bad news so they don't catch the bad news disease. This is also why you want to communicate with your clients directly about bad news, but going to the media yourself helps to inoculate them from sort of the sensationalism of getting the filing news or whatever. So think about it this way. Your company's filing for bankruptcy. You know that the filing is going to happen on a Friday, so you send out a release on Monday to all the different media outlets that says, this Friday we're going to be filing for bankruptcy. Here's our plan to fix the company. These are the things that we're going to be doing, and this is what our hoped outcome, this is what our goal is in the restructuring that we're doing. As opposed to Friday coming along and the news people getting a note, hey, did you see that such and such filed for bankruptcy, right? Two very different stories are going to come out based on whether or not you sent that sort of inoculation news release, that bad news release that kind of let you tell your side of the story, or if you just let them report on the filing. Then maybe like 5 days later, they'll put your side of the story in. But by then, all the people in the audience have already just heard, oh, they're declaring bankruptcy, and said, oh, that company's closing. File that away. Once something is out there, it's really hard to change it. So once somebody gets a snippet of information, you don't know if they're even going to see the second newscast where they explain, well, they're declaring bankruptcy, but they'll be okay, right? They're just going to see that first one, and maybe they aren't ever going to learn anything else about your company. Bad news releases give that sort of important inoculation to keep the bad news from being so damaging. This last one's sort of a catch-all. Column notes, letters, guest columns, photos. You can even do a photo release, which can be a great piece, although it's probably done a lot less now that we have online galleries and online archives and things of that nature. But what you used to do was literally take the photos from an event, put a headline, put a lead, and then put the photos right in the release, and then send a disc, a CD, right? We don't obviously do that now, but send a CD with the pictures on it, along with the paper copy of the release, and the editors would look at it. And then a lot of times they would use those photos in a variety of places. They might use them online, they might use them in their print editions, so that was a pretty common thing to do. If you were going to do a photo release now, it might still be nice to create sort of the layout in a PDF or something to show them so they could look at the photos. But more than likely, you would do like a Dropbox link to the gallery and include all the information in the file names and metadata of the photos. But it's still something that could be done. There are some different kind of formats for news releases. You've got your traditional news release, which can go to a variety of different outlets. Traditional release can be sent to the newspaper, to a magazine, to a radio station, to a TV station. but it's a traditional format. So it's in writing. It has your basic headline, subheadline, lead sort of format. The second type of news release format that's becoming more and more popular, although there's a lot of disagreement about what makes up a social media release, is the social media news release. Social media news releases are optimized for sharing, both for the journalist and for the end user. So a social media news release could be a blog entry, or it could be a release that's housed on a web page, and usually it has links to sort of open up Twitter and put in the text of a tweet, or open up Facebook and put in the text of a Facebook post, so that folks can quickly share the release. So we'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. And the last one is a video news release. A video news release is different than a news release that goes to a television station. A video news release is actually a video. Okay, so it's just like sort of a TV newscast. It'll have opening narration, it might have a few interviews, it'll feature some B-roll. We'll take a look at video news releases in a couple weeks, and we will actually create one, so that'll be kind of fun. But don't think of a video news release as a news release for TV, because that would be a traditional news release. The video news release is actually a video. So more on that later. Now that we know what news releases do, and we know some of the types of news releases and formats, let's talk about how news releases behave across different media channels. If you're talking about editors in the print news, they're looking for certain things. So print news releases can be longer in length, right? They might even be feature news release. They might have lots of information. And the timeliness is least important. What does that mean? Generally, you can send a news release up to 3 weeks before you want the story in the paper, and that's preferable, so they can plan ahead, right? They publish every day, but they think about their stories sort of a long time beforehand. Television news releases are going to be shorter, okay? So that print news release might have lots of details and be long. A television release, you're really thinking in terms of, well, what would go in the 30 or 60 or 90-second slot on the news, and how can I write the release so that the producer can easily see what the script would look like? So you're going to have a shorter release, and timeliness is moderately important. You know, news reporters are deciding what they're going to put on the television news maybe a week to a couple of days out, right? You've seen previews for stories that are a little bit more feature-esque on the news, but when they're thinking about what's going to be on the 6 o'clock news, they might be thinking about it the day before or the day of. The radio is the shortest and most timely. Okay, so radio news releases are quite short, almost down to the point of being a script, and timeliness is the most important to them. Producers for radio decide what they're going to put on the air the morning of, or 15 minutes before it goes on air. So you need to be sending those releases right when you want them to go on. Right, you can send that print release 3 weeks in advance. The TV news release maybe a day in advance. And the radio news release, you want to send it half hour before the show. Depending on what it is. I mean, certainly there are exceptions to that. But as a rule, radio folk are making their decisions almost in real time. Speaking of groups that are making real-time decisions, social media releases are sort of their own animal. You could send them very far in advance if you're dealing with a blogger, or you could send them, right as something happens if you're dealing with somebody who's on Twitter. A social media release could be as small as a tweet. Have you ever seen a company say, "We signed LeBron," or, "New cookies launched today," right? You could have something really short on social, or you could be doing more. You could be doing a full blog entry. You could be sort of doing that release format where I was talking about, where you do the full story and then provide language for reporters to tweet, where they can just click the little Twitter icon and the language pops right up in their Twitter box. Social media releases are still sort of evolving and happening. Timeliness with those is crucial. Things break on social before they break on TV, before they break on radio, and definitely before they break in the print newspaper. Now, one thing to remember that's important is that television stations, newspapers, and radio stations are all on social. So you really have to think about what behavior you want them to do. If you want a reporter to come to your event today and take a picture, the type of information you're going to send them is quite different than if you want them to write a long format story in 3 weeks. So you always have to think about the channel and how their process functions. When do they make their news decisions? When do they write their scripts? When do they record? All of those things are crucial in terms of deciding when and how to release to different media channels. All right. All that aside, all the details and types aside, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What goes in a news release? Okay. Now, this says checklist, but this is not the checklist. The checklist will be available for you on Springboard, but let's talk about parts of a news release. So first, you're going to have the identity and address or location of the organization. Identity usually means their logo. Sometimes it means font colors and other things. Contact for additional information or media contact. So who do you contact if you want to get more info, get photos, do an interview? Instructions for the timeline of the release. So is it for immediate release or is it for release next week? A headline and a subheadline that describe the contents of the story. The date and location where the release originated. That's your AP style dateline. A lead paragraph that gives an overview of the story. We'll talk more about that in a minute. All the supporting information that's needed. A boilerplate, which is a term we'll talk about, but basically it's a description of the organization. And then an end signal or an ending indication, which there's 2 options. So this is an overview. Don't need to get too much in depth here, but we will in a minute. What do these releases look like? Well, that depends on the company that you work in. I'm going to show you really quickly now a couple of release formats, and then I'm going to teach you a format that you can use for the rest of the semester and sort of take with you out into the work world. First of all, here's a release from Affect Public Relations, and this is a release that was housed online. It has some elements of a social media release, but you can see it has headline, subhead, AP style dateline. It has, well, actually we could argue as to whether or not that's an AP style dateline, but it's intended to be an AP style dateline. They have a lead paragraph, some internal sections, and then at the bottom you can see their boilerplate there where it says about the company and gives that information. Are there things missing from my list? Well, sure. We're missing an end signal, but that's pretty common when you put releases on the internet in sort of a social or blog format. Here's another different release. You can see that there's a headline but no subhead. There's a dateline. It is not AP style. It seems like a lot of people either don't use AP style or are not concerned with AP style. However, every job interview I've ever gone on has asked me if I can do AP style, and specifically, in many cases, has checked my ability to do datelines. So that is what you will learn to do, regardless of what these other companies are doing. However, when you go into your first job, if they tell you, this is how we do our dateline, and it's not AP style, that's okay. You know, you need to have the flexibility of being able to do what a particular employer wants, or in PR, in some cases, it won't be the employer, it'll be a client at an agency. So you might have 3 or 4 different ways you do things based on which client you're doing the work for. So you can see that it has that dateline lead paragraph. It has an internal bulleted list, which is not uncommon. And then you'll see the boilerplate about Akron Canton Airport, and you'll see an end signal on this one, even though it's on a website. So that's another way to look at it. Here is an ancient history news release from Cleveland State University, where I used to work. And yes, that is my maiden name there under the contact, Julie Powell. Why am I showing you this? Because it's a really different format in a lot of senses. So instead of having an AP style dateline, Cleveland State would put the date of the release underneath the release information on the top right there. And that number, 13447, was an internal catalog number. We kept a giant book of all the releases, and we had to have all the numbers and make sure that every number was accounted for. So that would fall under a format different from AP style datelines, but something that a company that you work for might do. I mean, hopefully at this point, the archives you'll be working with are electronic and not printed out in a book like the ones I was working with back there in 2004, but no guarantees. A lot of companies do things different. You'll also notice that this release has just some format differences than what I will describe in the lecture, and that's okay. That will happen. So then why do I teach you the way I teach you? Well, as I've gone through my career as an educator, I've kind of collected releases and I've looked at PR Newswire releases and I've talked to different agencies and people, and I've come up with a basic format that I think most people would find reasonable. I'd like you to learn it to a T. I'd like you to learn it with a sense of perfection, just so you understand how detailed you have to be when you're out in the field. However, you shouldn't cling to it for dear life. Even if you go into another class at the University of Akron and they tell you, oh, hey, do this instead, or don't italicize your subheadline, that's okay. Do what the teacher wants. That's the best way to make friends and influence people, is to follow the guidelines of your particular supervisor at the time, whether that be an educator or an employer. Okay? I'm just giving you some best practices. Now, once you've been at your company for 10 years and everybody trusts you, then you could take my format and use it and say, this is our new format, and that'll be great. So, what should your release look like? Like I just said, until you work for that company that has a predetermined style, I'd like you to adopt the style points that I'm giving you when creating a Word document release. Use an AP style dateline, always. You'll learn about what that is in a minute. Always have a head and a subhead for a release. Always include a boilerplate, which is that about the company. Left align your paragraphs and your headlines, and put the logo and contact information at the top. So that, for this class, all of those things are things that you need to do. Let's go through the different parts of the release now and talk about what they are. So I said identity, and another way to talk about identity is brand elements. You want to have the organization logo at the top. You want to use their font palette if you know what it is. So if you know that the University of Akron's fonts are Avenir and Caslon Pro, and you happen to be doing a release for the University of Akron, you want to go ahead and make sure that you use those fonts. You also want to use the organization's colors, if appropriate. For the most part, releases are going to be black and white, but sometimes they're not. So you want the release to look like it comes from the company. In addition, you also need to have the contact information at the top. And so actually, if you look at the little example I gave here, this State of Ohio one has the brand identity, so it has the Ohio logo and the name of the office. And beneath that sort of brand elements, it appears to be their brand standard to include the name of the governor and his deputy on their news releases. Then, below that, actually you see the release information there, which we'll talk about in a minute, for immediate release, and then they give the date, which is interesting and a different way of doing a date line. Again, another way. We're not going to do ours that way, but you have that for immediate release there, which is the release information. And then beneath that, you have your contact, okay? So it has Stan's name, Director of Communication, his title, his phone number, and his email address. At the bottom of this news release, it also had the address of the Department of Medicaid. So you want to make sure that your release has the name of the organization, somewhere that the physical mailing address of the organization if you know it. If you don't know it, then that's okay. What do I mean if you don't know it? Well, if it's a client and they work out of, 6 different offices, or what if they're a virtual company, they work out of someone's home? Okay, you might not have a physical address in that case, but for the most part you will. The contact name is going to be the person that you want the media to call to talk about the release. Not who you want them to interview. So if you ideally want them to interview the president of your company, that's great, but their name doesn't go here. The name that goes here is the person who's going to facilitate communication, which will most likely be you. So most likely it will say your name, your title, and then the phone number and the email address. You want to have a contact name, office number. This day and age, a cell number, mobile numbers are very commonly included, an email address, and then if you're doing an event. So if you're doing, let's say, I don't know, a mini golf outing, which happens to be one that we're going to use a little bit later, you might want to have a separate contact name for that actual event day. So maybe the director of communication isn't going to actually be at the event. Maybe the event planner is. So underneath the communication professional information, you would put the event planner information. You would put for day of event contact Sarah Smith and then her phone number. That way the media knows if I'm planning to show up and walk around the event and take photos, I need to call Sarah at that number to make sure I can get in. Okay, so that's what the day of event contact is about. When I grade your releases, I'm going to be looking to see if all this information is there. Now for class, unless you're specifically given a person's information, sometimes you might have to make up a number. That's okay. Put a placeholder in and put a fake number in it so I know that you know that this needs to be on the release. The next thing is the release information. And the release information generally tells us when we can use the information that's in the release. 99% of the time, the release information is for immediate release, meaning as soon as you see this, you can publish it in your outlet, okay? Most news releases are for immediate release. Sometimes, however, you might have a sensitive subject. So you might be Canon cameras and you're going to announce a brand new lens that no one's ever seen before. And you're going to do that on March 1st. Well, you might want to give people the lens ahead of time to write reviews, to play with it, to form a reaction to it. So you send all that out and you write on the release, instead of for immediate release, you write for release after 10 a.m. on March 1st, 2020. The reporters should then know, okay, I can play with the product, I can type up my review, but I can't publicly release any information till after 10 a.m. on March 1st. Usually, the purpose there is you want to give the company a chance to launch their own product. So you're going to use release information that gives a specific date or time when you want the information held until after an announcement. Okay? If the information is truly sensitive and you don't trust that the media will hold it quiet, you might just have to wait to release it. Okay? You're asking the media to hold the information with the, for release by date, but there's no legal precedent, there's no legal requirement for the media to hold the information. Of course, you might be angry with them and never work with them again, but if something is truly sensitive, I would wait and just release it when it can be for immediate release. There's no guarantee an unscrupulous editor wouldn't run something that you intended for release after a certain date. So that release information goes at the top, either right above or right below the contact information, depending on the kind of layout you're using. The next important item for your news release is the headline. Okay, the headline is your first chance to make an impression. The headline is where the journalist decides if they should read the rest of your story. Okay, read the rest of your release. They read the headline's not compelling, they move on to the next. And you have to understand that journalists are getting 40 or 50 news releases mailed to them at a time. Okay, so they have to make a decision really quickly. Am I going to read this or am I not going to read this? Okay, so the headline is really, really, really important. Now, I will tell you a piece of advice now that I will reiterate later. Don't get stuck on the headline. Don't sit down to write something and start with the headline, and then when you can't come up with a great one, get frustrated. I would never start with the headline, actually. For the most part, I would start with the lead. And so you'll see my little handwritten, quote unquote, handwritten note down at the bottom. Don't try to write your headline first. It's really easy to get stuck. The headline must contain the key message of the news release. I would say 85 to 90% of the time, the headline is the key message of the release. Sometimes you'll get a creative headline here or there. Now, don't get crazy creative with your headlines. In fact, I would say in the history of teaching this course, the biggest problem I have with student headlines is that, the number one biggest problem is that they try to be too creative, and I read the headline and I have no idea what the story is going to be about. You do not want a reporter to read the headline of your story and shrug and say, I have no idea. No idea what the story is. I don't know what's going to happen in this story. I don't care about the story. You want the headline to tell a person, this is what you get in this story, okay? The example that I often use is one time I was going through some press releases that came into my email account when I was writing for the magazines. I got an email that said, do you believe in life after death? And I was like, oh my God, what is this email? And it was a news release essentially titled, Do You Believe in Life After Death? And I found out it was a book that somebody had written about their out-of-body experience, and it had nothing to do with me or with my articles or my beat or any of that. They had not chosen a good reporter to send it to, but it was just so bizarre, and they sent me several of them, and I kept seeing that, do you know what happens after you die? I'm like, whoa, what is this? Don't try to be clever like that. It would have been better if they sent me a release that said, Newport, Maine author writes book on out-of-body experience. I would have said, I write about Cleveland, so nope. And I write about fashion. Nope. None of this appeals to me or is pertinent to me. What I ended up doing was writing the company and saying, hey, listen, I only write stories about X, Y, and Z, so stop sending me news releases about literally every other letter. And that's something that you'll kind of figure out and work with, but don't make your headline so creative that I have no idea what the story's about. You can center the headline or you can left align it. For your work in here, I would prefer for you to left align it. And again, that's just me making a suggestion, giving you a detail to kind of practice. So practice left aligning your headlines. The headline should be bold and a slightly larger font size than the rest of the text. Headlines are not punctuated like sentences, so they never have a period at the end. However, they should be a complete phrase. So a headline should at least have a subject and a verb, okay? But it should not be a complete sentence, and that it should not have a period at the end. Headlines are also in capital case. What is capital case? You should write this down because you will need this for the rest of the semester. Capital case is a type of capitalization where every word that is considered an important word is capitalized. So the only words that are not capitalized are the, it, an, or, and, is. Okay, small two-letter words that you don't capitalize in standard writing. Otherwise, everything else gets capitalized. So I have an example of a headline here. Michael Andretti replaces son Marco on NBC's Celebrity Apprentice. Pretty straightforward headline. Definitely would know what that story was about if I got a news release with this headline on it. It's in capital case. The only thing that's not capitalized is the word on, which is not capitalized in capital case because it's a small word. Okay, so Michael Andretti replaces son is capitalized. It's a short word, but it's an important word in the sentence. It's not a conjunction or another smaller part of speech. Okay. Again, don't try to write your headline first. It's really easy to get stuck on the headline. The headline should be simple. It should be concise, short as possible, and interesting. Headlines should not contain commas as a general rule. However, there are some exceptions to that. There are two I'm going to talk about. The first exception you can see in this example. It says Perfect Temp, an FDA-approved fertility home kit, is now widely available in CVS pharmacies around the U.S. In this particular example, the fact that Perfect Temp is the trademark name of the product for which we're trying to create awareness. We're trying to create awareness of our product that's just been FDA approved, right? This Perfect Temp Fertility Home Kit. In most cases, I would rewrite this headline to say, FDA approved fertility home kit now widely available in CVS pharmacies. That's what I would say. So I would get rid of the Perfect Temp. I would get rid of around the US. I would shorten it up a lot. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't want to take Perfect Temp out of the headline because we're trying to build brand name awareness. So in this limited case where you're trying to create brand awareness of a brand, you could put the name of the brand, comma, the description of the brand, comma, the verb, which is what we have here. Perfect Temp, an approved FDA fertility home kit, is now widely available in CVS pharmacies around the US. Okay? So why do we allow the commas here? Because we're trying to put first the brand name. If you need to put the brand name first, or the name of a new product that you're launching, then explain the product, then say that it's available, that's one time when I would say using commas is okay. So commas are used in this headline because it keeps the brand name first, which is the most important information of the release as far as the client is concerned. Another exception to the no commas rule in headlines is if you're putting the date at the end. So if you're saying, Lake Farm Parks open their brand new cheese making area, comma, June 1st. That's an okay use of a comma. So that's an exception. You could put a comma in there. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we sort of select a headline, or what different headlines are positive or negative. So here are 4 headlines. If we were in class together, I would ask you to read them. We'd read them out loud, and then we would pick which ones you like and which ones you don't like. So here they are. John Corigliano, a famous composer and friend to the animals, writes a sonata to benefit PETA. Renowned composer John Corigliano writes sonata to benefit PETA. Pulitzer Prize-winning composer John Corigliano writes sonata to benefit PETA. And the last one, download renowned composer John Corigliano's new composition on iTunes and support PETA. What's wrong with the first one? Well, it has those commas, so we have to think about the exceptions. Is there a date exception? No, there's no date. So the other exception was when we're trying to put the brand name out ahead. So John Corigliano, a famous composer and friend to the animals, comma, writes sonata. Ultimately, I think we don't care, number one, about John Corigliano's brand. This is about PETA. Number 2, I think that we don't care that he's a friend to the animals, right? So this first one doesn't work. The second one works better. Renowned composer. So what type of composer? An important composer. John Corigliano writes sonata to benefit PETA. Very straightforward. We can make that more specific as opposed to renowned. We could say award-winning composer. I actually think that John Corigliano might have a Grammy, so we could have said Grammy award-winning composer John Corigliano, or he might not. Somebody can look into that. But he has won a Pulitzer Prize, so Pulitzer Prize-winning composer John Corigliano writes sonata to benefit PETA. What's good about this one? Well, renowned composer's okay, but I could just be lying, right? I could say that anybody's renowned or important. However, to say Pulitzer Prize-winning, that's not nebulous, right? That's very specific. It's a person who's won this prize, and we can prove that that's the case. So that's a very strong opening. The fourth headline is sort of interesting, right? To now download renowned composers' new composition on iTunes to support PETA. Where might that one be appropriate? On a social media news release, that would be appropriate, right? Because what's the purpose of what we're doing on social? To get people to buy the album. So that last one isn't one that I would use on a print news release. But if I was doing a social news release that I wanted people to share, I think I would go that route, even though it seems a little bit more marketing-esque and has a little bit more of sort of that marketing call to action. So just some thoughts about those headlines. Something that you might not be aware of, I'm pretty sure most of you knew that these things had headlines, but what about the subheadline? The subheadline is a sentence, so it has punctuation, it has a period at the end, has a capital at the beginning, and it's lowercase throughout. It's not in capital case, except for proper nouns, which obviously would be caps. Subhead ends in a period. It appears in italics beneath the headline of a release. It should expand upon the headline or offer new and interesting details not in the headline. The way I always put it is, the subheadline is your second chance to persuade the reporter. Well, if you're emailing the release, it might be the third chance. First chance is the subject line, second chance is the title, or the headline, and then the third one would be the subhead. Okay, so how do we use a subheadline that way? Let's look at these two examples and talk about how the subheadline works as a persuasive device. Here we have our headline, Michael Andretti replaced his son Marco on NBC Celebrity Apprentice. So here we have our headline from before, and here's two subheads. The first one says, Marco Andretti chose to withdraw from a popular primetime program after losing a close friend in a racing accident. The second one says, Michael Andretti brings his legendary business acumen and tenacious sportsmanship to the primetime reality program. Usually in the classroom, I would ask the students, well, which of the two of these subheads do you like better? And invariably, people would have different opinions. The first one kind of takes the release in a particular direction, which is to talk about this racing accident and the friend who passed away in Marco Andretti. Why is that positive? Well, it's positive because people are going to be interested in the racing accident and what happened. And in the same way that sort of having David Cetera be our keynote speaker makes something newsworthy, this racing accident angle, we call it an angle, kind of really amps up the story and makes me interested. Like, oh, what happened to Marco and his friend? His friend passed away. What happened? The downside to that subhead is, number one, ethics. Should we be talking about something that's probably quite a private situation? Okay. And two, it kind of takes things in a negative direction, and it talks about the person leaving the show instead of the person coming to the show. Whereas the second subhead talks about Michael Andretti's business acumen and sportsmanship and how he's going to make the program better. Okay? So in this case, I would definitely more likely choose the second one. However, it really depends. The first headline will create far more controversy than the second. So imagine that the journalist is reading and they get a headline that says, Michael Andretti replaces Marco on the Celebrity Apprentice. And then they get this headline. And then they get a subhead that talks about his friend who passed away. Aha! That is your third and final chance via email to persuade the person, to persuade the reporter. If you persuade them, they're going to read the whole thing. If you don't persuade them, they're just going to move on to the next, right? So this is sort of the third way that you kind of hook them. You have a good subject line to your email. You have an excellent news release headline that completely describes the situation or the event or the announcement or the launch. And then third, you have the subheadline, which kind of adds an additional dimension to the story. It's a great place to explore the angle of the story, okay? And that can get the reporter even further interested than the headline, which has got to be concise and simple. The subheadline allows you to introduce context and feeling into the story. Subheads can be more narrative than headlines, and they can include what I would call qualifying clauses, or those commas that we talked about, perfect temp, comma, a home fertility kit, comma. That's something that you can use in a subheadline. You can describe things in a subheadline. Subheads are only one sentence. Don't get excited and write 3 sentences like a lead paragraph. You only get one in a subhead. It needs to be succinct and concise, just like the headline. And as I've said several times now, it really is your second or third chance to persuade the media to read the rest of your release. Subheads are quite important. Now we've arrived to the moment of truth, the AP-style dateline. Okay, the lead paragraph of your story, which is the first paragraph of your release, must begin with an AP style dateline. So here are some examples. Pensacola, Florida, August 1st, 2020. The Pensacola Art Museum opens a new exhibit. And the second one is exactly the same, but it incorporates parentheses where the first one does not. Both of these are technically correct. What should you notice about them? Well, first of all, notice that the city is in all caps. Okay. An AP style dateline is the first thing that happens in your news release, and the very first part of the dateline should be the city in which the release was written in all caps. Unless you're doing work for a client and you're in an agency. So maybe you wrote the release in Cleveland, but your client is in Minnesota. Put Minnesota, don't put Cleveland, okay? That's fine. So what's the first thing we have? The city, and it's in all caps. That is AP style. City all caps, comma, space, state abbreviation based on AP style's abbreviation chart. And then you get your date, which is usually month, day, comma, year, okay? Sometimes separated by dashes, sometimes separated by parentheses. That's sort of a style decision I'll let you make. I tend to prefer the top version here, okay? Now, the biggest mistake that students make when they first start doing AP style datelines is, well, sometimes they forget to capitalize the city in all caps, but a lot of times what they do is forget to look up the AP style abbreviation for the state, and instead they use the postal abbreviation. If you use the postal abbreviation for your AP style dateline, you will get major points off your paper. If you forget to capitalize the city in all caps, major points, okay? So be sure to use the correct state abbreviation, which you can find in your AP style book, or you can look online and find a list of sort of AP style datelines, okay? And check the cities that do not require a state. There are, I think, 14 or 15 cities around the nation that you don't put a state next to in AP style. Cleveland is one, but Akron is not. So if you wanted to do a dateline with Cleveland, you would put Cleveland in all caps, and then you would just put dash August 1st, 2020 dash. Okay? If you did Cleveland. If you did New York City, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, those all are places that don't require the state at all. You just put the name of the city, and that's enough. Okay? Note that new AP style guidelines ask you to spell out the state name in the body of your stories. And while we're at it, let me also give you a little hint. Ohio, the abbreviation for Ohio is capital O, lowercase h-i-o. It's just the state written out. And so that could be confusing, and sometimes it can lead students to forget that there are different abbreviations in AP style for states like Florida, which you can see here is abbreviated as capital F, lowercase l-a, period. Okay, so students often miss easy points on the dateline. If you just follow this basic guide, city in all caps, comma, state abbreviated in AP style, dash, month, day, year, comma in between, dash, you will get the dateline correct every single time, and that will help you to get full credit on your writing assignments. Now we've come to the lead. The lead is technically the first paragraph in your news release. Okay? The lead paragraph for your news release should include no more than 3 sentences. It should begin fresh. This is a really important point. So let's say your headline, announces the event. The subheadline talks a little bit about some more details at the event. When you start the lead, you pretend that you didn't have that headline and that subhead. You write it as a standalone piece of information, as if it could stand alone by itself. In fact, if the news reporter just got the lead of your story and didn't get the headline or the subhead or any of the other content, if they just got the lead, they should know what the story is about and have a lot of the key information. The lead paragraph should reiterate the key message. So if the key message is that you're launching a new camera, or the key message is that you're hosting an event, or the key message is that you had an accident at your factory and there were no injuries, right? That should be stated in the lead. You also want to include the angle. Haven't talked a lot about the angle at this point. We'll talk about it more as the semester progresses. But in many cases, you want your news releases to have an angle, okay? What does an angle mean? It's a context, or I guess the best way to talk about angle is to talk about the resulting story. So you could look at multiple angles in any particular topic. Let's take the topic of Christmas, okay? Christmas. Let's say you're doing a release to talk about shopping at the mall on Christmas, and let's say you're not the mall, but you are a small independently owned business in the community. Okay, what's the angle of this release for shopping? In fact, let's just broaden the topic. Let's say you're writing a release about shopping for Christmas, and you're a small locally owned business, and overall, the point that you want to make with your release is that people should shop small, right? They should shop at locally owned businesses, okay? So you're sitting there and you're thinking, all right, I'm going to write a press release about why it's bad to shop in big box stores. Okay, well, that's kind of broad. What's your angle going to be? I'm specifically going to talk about how shopping at the mall damages the environment. That's the angle, right? The topic is basically why shouldn't you shop in chain or big box stores? But the specific angle for the story that I just mentioned is eco-friendliness, right? Or carbon footprint or climate concern. So basically, why shopping at the mall increases your carbon footprint, or why shopping at the mall is bad for the planet. All right, it's an angle on the basic story of why you shouldn't shop in the mall on Christmas, or why you should shop at little local shops on Christmas. So that's the angle. If you're writing a press release that's a launch, announcement, or event, and particularly if it's an event, you need to have all of the information for that event in the lead, meaning date, time, and location at the bare minimum. Just like there are types of news releases, there are different types of leads. What you're going to be writing in this course in a news release that's an event, an announcement, a spot release, most of your basic style releases are going to have what we call conventional summary lead, or a hard news lead. This type of lead is used in straight news, meaning hard news, or I guess you could call it plain news, like just news, right? On Friday at 5 o'clock, X happened. That sort of news has a conventional summary lead. Conventional summary leads include the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the story. Okay, whichever detail is the most prominent usually opens the lead. So you could have a who lead, or a why lead, or a how lead. A who lead is going to talk about the person or the people involved first. A what lead is probably the most common, and that's what's going on. We're having XYZ type of event. That would be sort of a what lead, or a lead that features and leads off with the what. If you're writing in different formats, not a basic press release, but a feature release, or a feature story, or a newsletter story for a newsletter in your company, and we'll talk about this later, but there's lots of different kinds of writing that a PR writing person might do, you might want to use one of these other leads. They're called alternative or soft leads. They stray from the above format, so they don't do the who, what, where, when, and why, and there are lots of different ones. So first, let's talk about blind leads. Blind leads leave out an important fact for a surprise. Okay, so you might do a blind lead where you talk about, there's a great example of a blind lead where the story talks about a man who was in a car accident. It talks about how the car caught on fire and he lost, the car's totaled. And then in the middle of the story, it tells you, surprise, the car was his house. Okay, he's homeless and he lives in that car. So not only did his car burn down in the accident, his home burned down in the accident as well. That's a blind lead. The blind lead leaves out that important fact to kind of surprise you a little bit later in the release. Another kind of lead that you might have is a delayed or a narrative lead. This features a little anecdote that sets the scene. So let's say you were doing a feature release about back to school practices or back to school, and let's say you're a manufacturer of some products that parents typically buy. An alternative or a narrative or an anecdotal lead might be, little Susie's getting ready for school. She picks up her pencils, puts them in her pencil case, and stuffs it in her backpack, along with different supplies, a box of tissues for the classroom, and all of her pencils, pens, markers, and crayons. All her little hopes for the upcoming school year are stuffed into the bag one by one. That's an anecdotal lead. You tell a little story, you set the scene, you get somebody in the mood. We don't use those sorts of leads in event releases, announcement releases, in spot releases, because all of those releases sort of have that hard news style. But that anecdotal or narrative lead can be really great if you're doing a feature release from which you want a media person to write a feature story. Quote leads are exactly what they sound like. You quote a person directly. And question leads are also exactly what they sound like. So when you hear a story that leads off like, what would you do if your son choked on a peanut? Right? Story at 7. No, that's a question lead. Okay, it's a lead that asks someone a question. One thing that's important about question leads to note is that you always want to avoid yes or no questions. So you never want to write a release at the question lead that says, do you like chocolate? Because then if the person says no, they stop reading the release and move on. So you have to be a little bit careful with question leads. In general, though, you're going to really be focused on the conventional summary lead for most of the pieces that you write in this course. So let's take a look at a sample lead. This is a lead from a story that we've kind of made up here about an artist visiting the Akron Art Museum. So you see we've got our AP style dateline, Akron, all caps, comma, Ohio, which again, as I mentioned, that's the AP style abbreviation of Ohio. It's spelled out with a capital O. February 10th, 2020. And here's our lead. Akron Art Museum presents Psychological Expressionism, an exhibit featuring the way out style and suspended plexiglass paintings of 80-year-old local artist Sid Rubin. The opening reception is Friday, March 2nd from 8 o'clock p.m. to 9 o'clock p.m. in the museum's main gallery at 1 South High Street in Akron. The show runs through March 31st. One thing I would note about this lead is, there's one thing I want to point out about AP style, and then one thing I'll point out, actually, that's not AP style in this lead. So where you see Friday, March 2nd, notice that it says Friday, March, and then the number 2, but there's no ND after the 2, and at the very end, it says the show runs through March 31st, no ST. In AP style, you do not put the ST or the RD or the ND after letters. Okay, 3rd, 2nd, 31st. That is not AP style. So that is correct here. March 2nd with no ND is correct AP style for dates. Now, what's the questionable item? The questionable item is the times. In AP style, you're not required to put 8:00. You can just put 8 p.m. - 9 p.m. The only time that it's sort of advisable on occasion to put the 8:00 is if the time next to it was 9:15. That just makes them look a little bit more parallel. But truly, in AP style, the expectation is that you not put the 2 zeros, and you're not even strictly required to put them if the time next door has like 9:15. That's just a preference that some people have. So that's a little note for you. In AP style, it's 8 p.m., no zeros. Now that we've got our lead, we need to write the body of the release. The body of the release will expand about details in the lead. In this case, we wanted to talk about, so if you think about that lead, let's go back and think about that lead. This man is presenting his exhibit, and we know when the opening reception is, we know where the gallery is located, and when the show runs through. So that's all the most important details. Well, what's left to go in the release? Well, we might want the biography of the artist. We might want some information about the art itself, the style that it's created in, the materials that are used. We might want to know about the reception. Like when you say reception, do you mean a full spread, or is it just some cheese and crackers, or is it completely food free and just a time to meet the artist. Lastly, we would want some information about the museum or the gallery. Okay, so what do we do to kind of go through the rest of the body here? Well, conventionally, the next paragraph is a quote from the journalist to use. When a journalist writes a story, okay, they're going to have a quote. That's called sourcing. Now, in the best case scenario, you'll send out this news release and they won't actually use the quote for that purpose. They might use the quote as a starting point. They might call the person who gave the quote and do an interview to get their own quotes. However, in certain cases where someone's on a deadline, the radio station is looking for something to run in the next hour, they might use that quote because they don't have time to call and get one from someone in your organization. So for that reason, the quote needs to be really well written. Usually, a public relations person will write the quote and then give it to the person who is supposed to say the quote for approval. That's a very common practice in PR. So here's the quote for this release. "It was so exciting to see Sid Rubin's plexiglass double-sided paintings hung from the ceiling," says Margie Smith, curator of the Rubin exhibit. "Each painting offers the viewer two distinct perspectives. The show is like nothing I've ever seen," she says. Okay, when you're doing press releases, it's pretty common practice to use says instead of said because it makes the journalist feel more like they're doing the interview. When you're writing in a newspaper, however, you're always going to use said, okay? And you're always going to put said after the name of the person, except in a case like this one. So in general, this should say, "It was so exciting to see Sid Rubin's plexiglass double-sided paintings hung from the ceiling," Margie Smith said. However, in this case, as I said, because this is a news release, we like to use the present tense of says, and because it's Margie Smith, curator of the Rubin exhibit, right, putting said after that would make the sentence awkward. So AP style allows for us to put it before the name in cases where the title or description after the name is long. So here it says Margie Smith, curator of the Rubin exhibit, but if we were just using her name, if we knew who she was, we could say Margie Smith said, and that would make it read a lot better and more correct in terms of AP style. But what we have here is currently correct as well. Because she has a long title after her name, we can put the word said or says before her name. So just to reiterate, when you're writing your quotes, said or says should come after the name of the person, unless there's a long title, in which case then it can be placed before the name of the person. Okay? The next paragraph talks about the opening reception. So we have our quote, and then we decided the next most important thing is the opening reception. So the opening reception on Friday, March 2nd gives attendees a chance to meet and greet the artist and his family. In addition, the evening will feature hors d'oeuvres by the Greenhouse Tavern, custom martinis by Magic Teeny, and music by local jazz greats, the Black Ties. Okay, so that second paragraph gives us information on the event itself. Then we get the information on the artist. Okay, Sid Rubin was something of a late bloomer in the art world, reinventing himself at age 60. Rubin left a 40-year sales career to pursue his artistic passion. "It wasn't always an easy road," says Rubin. Now there, we should swap it. So it wasn't always an easy road, Rubin says, right? Because his name is short, so we could put says after his name. "Students in my first art class teased me about my way out crazy style. I've been blessed to have grown from those early pieces to the work I'm showcasing today." And by the way, if you want to know why I didn't go ahead and swap that, it's because this came from an actual release. But that would be correct to put says before, after his name. Next, we have a paragraph on the work. So it talks specifically about the paintings and how they are made. "His plexiglass works represent a unique approach to painting. Using both oil and acrylic, Rubin begins with an image on one side of the plexiglass, layering paint on top of paint until his desired image emerges. When viewed from the opposite side, it is possible to see a negative of the image with the first layer in the foreground rather than covered by the other layers." So, basic paragraph that describes his work. "Due to his unique method of painting, these works are best viewed from multiple vantage points. To give the viewer the best vantage point, curator Margie Smith has hung many of the plexiglass panels from the ceiling, while others are installed in stands that protrude from the floor. This non-traditional installation will be a delight for viewers young and old, Smith says, right? See how it should be flipped there? Then in our last paragraph, we have the details about when it will run, what the gallery hours are, what the cost is, and other logistics. Now, some people's philosophy is that this information should go right up under the quote. And I think that that's valid, and if you did that, I would not obviously take points off, because I think it's a valid point. However, I believe that most people tend to look for this information at the end of the release. They tend to just assume, oh, the details about the tickets and the hours must be at the bottom, and they go right down there looking for it. So for that reason, I think that there's an argument to be made for putting this third in the release because it's really important information, or putting it last because that's where people tend to look for it. Now, how did I choose the order of these paragraphs? That's something we haven't talked about yet. I used inverted pyramid style, which suggests that the most important information should be at the top of your piece and the least important should be at the very bottom of your piece. Now, I think that in public relations, we would use what I would call sort of an adjusted inverted pyramid. And what I mean by adjusted inverted pyramid is that, yes, we do strive to put the most important information at the top of the release and kind of to go down from there to the least important information, except that we sort of use a persuasive perspective on top of inverted pyramid. Let me give you an example. If you were doing a news release for a large foundation, you were doing a benefit. They were going to have a big benefit. In fact, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Pandemonium at Cleveland Public Theater. Pandemonium is an awesome event. They have like 30 stages of entertainment all going on at the same time. Lots of different performances and performance styles, and people come out for this event. It's very exciting. If I was writing the news release for Pandemonium, I would definitely have a traditional lead that says, what the event is, when the event is, the location of the event. But there's one piece of what I would call important information that I would definitely leave out of that opening paragraph, and that's the cost per ticket. The cost per ticket is actually quite important. I would say that it's more important than a lot of some of the details about specific performers or information about how the money will be used, right? As a reader and as a journalist, knowing the price of the ticket is pretty important. However, I want to encourage the journalist to put the price at the end of their story. So I want to put it at the end of my release so that they hopefully put it at the end of their story. And why do I want it at the end? Well, think about it this way. You're reading a story in the paper about Pandemonium, and you read that there's this event, and you see the dates and a description of what it is, and then you see tickets, $175. Don't quote me on that, but I know it's up there. And you might think, God, $175? I'm out, and you don't read the rest. However, if you instead read the whole release, read the whole story, learn about all the different performers that are going to be there and all the fun things they're going to do and the great cocktails and the desserts and all this other stuff, right? And then you get to the very end and you see that price, at least you might be convinced to attend because of all the great stuff. You had a chance to see all the great stuff that's part of the event, and then you had a chance to see the price. You didn't let the price stop you. At that point, you might think, well, man, it's just so cool. I guess it's worth it. That is an example of how we might change inverted pyramid or adjust inverted pyramid to manipulate the outcome for persuasive reasons, right? Ultimately, we want to persuade people to come to our event. So putting the price information in the first sentence might not help us do that. So as you're creating your own pieces, you're going to need to go through and consider persuasion in addition to inverted pyramid. I would suggest starting out with an outline that's sort of an inverted pyramid style, and then see if anything is more persuasive than others. You might find that inverted pyramid can be difficult sometimes as well. If you think about the case we just are talking about now with Sid Rubin, actually let me go back here. Information about the artist, the art itself, the reception, and the gallery. Well, I would say that someone who's coming to the exhibit might care the most about the art that they're going to see and the reception that they're going to attend. Then they might hear about the artist biography, and then they might want to know the specific hours of the gallery. However, I could also make an argument that because of Sid's unique story, how he reinvented himself after age 40 and became maybe not the world famous artist, but a fairly well known artist, that's a cool story. Maybe the coolness of that story trumps the other items, so that really, information about the artist should then come before information about the paintings or information about the reception. So there's interpretation here. It's not just black and white. You have to decide what's going to be most interesting to your audience. All right, you've got your headline, your subhead, you've got your lead, your AP style dateline, you've got your quote, you've got your body paragraphs, all the information is there, everything that anyone would need to know to attend the event is there. The last thing you're going to get is a boilerplate. What is a boilerplate? Well, it's an antiquated term that has to do with the printing press. So back in the day, you would actually press releases on a press. Obviously today we could print them on our printer, but more likely than not, we're just going to email our press release out and not send a physical copy. A lot of things have changed. When I first started out, we were faxing releases and we were sending couriers to get them there same day to other companies who wanted hard copies. And now, by and large, we're putting them in email. This is another holdover from those old times. Your company's description, so about the University of Akron, for example, back many years ago, would be on a metal plate, like a stamp, and you would just stamp it on the bottom of each news release. That was the boilerplate. It was literally a boilerplate of information about your company. And so you'll also hear people who have been in the industry a while talk about boiler content, like, oh, that was just some boiler, because it's something that you would just put in every document. So the boilerplate should go in almost every PR document that you create. What is a boilerplate, first of all? It's a description of the company. Literally, it says about the company, put the company's name in there. So, about Taco Bell, about Chipotle. I guess I'm in the mood for a taco. About Nike, okay? About Giant Eagle, right? No matter what the organization is, you just put about in front of it, and then you literally explain the organization. You might start with the number of locations, the number of years it's open, or the year it was founded. If it's a publicly traded organization, you might use the stock symbol in there. Or if it's a nonprofit, you might identify it as a 501c3. You want to have the function of the organization in the boilerplate. So at some point in the boilerplate, you want to say, what is the mission? What do we sell? What do we do? Etc. If you've been given any major recent awards and rankings, those would appear on the boilerplate. And then the last thing that usually goes in the boilerplate is the organization's website. You just put the website and a period at the end. So www.blablabla.com, period. That's usually the last bit of the boilerplate. Your boilerplate is going to have a bold left-aligned header in the same point size font as the regular body copy of your release. The text should be succinct and utilize professional language. And this brings me to an important point. When you're writing a news release in general, you want to avoid we, us, them, and their. We, us, them, and their. The only place in a news release you should use the word we is in the quote. Okay? The rest of the time you're speaking professionally in the third person, just like you're telling a news story, something that you are not personally related to. So, in the boilerplate, you would say, Old Town Pizza uses fresh ingredients from local sources. So under About Old Town Pizza, there might be, Old Town Pizza opened in 1982 and served its first blah 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 pizza to the local town. Old Town uses fresh ingredients from local sources to handcraft each pizza pie, okay? Those are the kinds of things that would go in that boilerplate. You should also talk about the owners and founders in the third person. You don't want to talk about them in the second person or the first person, I or you. In fact, I should just not be in a PR document. There is almost no reason to use the word I in PR writing. Lastly, the boilerplate should have the unique value proposition of the organization. So it should emphasize anything that makes the business unique and differentiates it from other similar businesses. For example, we might talk about Old Town Pizza's most famous product, the Woogie Bear. If you know Old Town Pizza, you know what a Woogie Bear is. So what's the purpose of the boilerplate? Well, from the media person's perspective, they're receiving this news release from you, but they may not have any idea who your company is or your organization, what you do. They may not realize that you're a nonprofit. They may not realize that you're publicly traded. You wouldn't be both of those things at the same time, by the way. They might not know that you're award-winning, and they might not have a sense of what you do and what makes you unique. So the boilerplate goes on basically everything you send out in PR writing to give that information quickly and easily. So they don't have to go to your website and try to dig up information. They can just go to the bottom of your release and figure out what they need to figure out. All right, couple of little things that we should talk about in terms of formatting. If you're creating your release as a Word document or PDF, which by the way you always are for this class. Now what else would you create? Well, today it's actually really common to send them via email, and so via email you don't have a page distinction, page 1, page 2. But if you're actually going to make a printout of this release and you have 2 pages, you need to use a slug and more. So what is more? At the end of the first page, in the very last line at the bottom of the page, you need to put dash more dash. That lets the reporter know, hey, this isn't over, there's a second page. This is really important. Imagine if a reporter was trying to report from just the first page, but a really important detail was on the second page. That more would let them know, oh, I don't have all of it. Similarly, you put a slug at the top of the second page. A slug is not a snail. It's not the snail's cousin. It's a header that lets the editor or reporter know that they're looking at the second page of a release. So if they get the second page by itself, they realize that they're missing an important first page. Okay? So you wouldn't include this in an email release, but for printing and on your website, you do want to include it if you're doing a PDF or a doc. Okay, the slug should be in the header or at the very top of the page, right aligned. And basically, it's a shortened version of the headline with the long dash and the page number. So here is an example. Download Crilliano iTunes Trek, support PETA, page 2. That lets me know here is the story, roughly, and I'm on page 2. Now the title on the first page, or the headline on the first page, might be significantly longer, but we don't need to do that. We just need everybody to know that page 1 and page 2 go together, and that's what that slug does. Okay, so if your release is over 1 page, you need the more and you need the slug. Once you're done and you've got your boilerplate written and you've got everything there, at the very bottom, beneath everything, including the boilerplate, you're going to put an end signal. These are sort of signals, I guess, punctuation, that let the reporter know you're done talking. And there's 2 very commonly used ones. The 3 pound signs, or as my father-in-law would say, the 3 hashtags. It's really funny when he's like, look, a hashtag. The 3 pound signs, which would be centered, or another one that is commonly used is dash 30 dash. I prefer the 3 pound signs, so for our class, I would like you to use them. 3 pound signs center in the last line on the page. You could use the dash 30 dash in your regular life. I just don't know exactly what it stands for, so I don't like to use it. The end signal should be centered, and it literally comes at the very end, so after the boilerplate. Whew, this has been quite a long presentation with a lot of information flying at you. Let's finish up with a note on the length of the news releases. Generally, a news release should be kept to 1 page if possible. If it goes to 2 pages, that should mean that it absolutely had enough information. What I don't want to see is, 16 lines of space at the top of the page, or a humongous logo that takes up half the page. Your header for your release, including all those things we talked about, should not take up more than 1/3 of the page, and really it should probably take up 1/4 or less. Okay? So make sure you're formatting correctly, because that would really be a problem. If your logo is so large and your text is so large at the top that you don't even start the release till halfway through page 1, of course you're going to go to page 2. So it's also important to remember that most of the releases, as I just recently mentioned, will be posted online in email rather than faxed, or rather than like attached as a PDF. Think about an email. You don't want the release to go too far beyond the scroll, right? Think about an email. You have 1 page of space, and then you have to start scrolling. You want your release to kind of fit pretty solidly in that first page with a little bit under the scroll. The great news is we're not going to lose the second page of an email, right? Because it's 1 page and it's 1 place. However, that doesn't mean that you can just write as much as you want. Things should be simple, direct, and concise, and that will help your release to be well received. Well, we made it to the end of the news release overview. I know that there's a great deal of information here. Hopefully this will help you get started on writing your first news release. And I would suggest going through and kind of reviewing each section of the release piece by piece so that you have a sense of the structure of the release. So thank you so much for listening. This is Julie Cahigas for the University of Akron, PR Writing News Release Overview.